May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning. It is nice to be with you this morning, although I regret the circumstances that have necessitated your rector being away today. I hope to get a chance to meet some of you after the service and to get to know one another a little better. My wife Drew is here with us this morning. We live very nearby. This, I think, is the closest Episcopal church to where we live. We live just down by the Fairmount Cemetery. So I was saying before the service, it sure beats getting up at 4 o'clock, picking the bishop up at 6 o'clock, driving to Windsor for a 7:30 service. So this was almost leisurely by comparison. So here we are, the first Sunday of Advent. Maybe you've been through Advent once or twice before. Raise your hand if this is not your first Advent. So that should be every hand. This is the year that doesn't happen very often, when the first Sunday of Advent is not the Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend, which is nice for those of us who like to start Advent off right, but also enjoy our Thanksgiving extended weekend. The flip side of that, though, and particularly this year, is that Advent will be as short as it can possibly be. The fourth Sunday of Advent this year is on December the 24th, which should ring a bell to your little kid heart as also being Christmas Eve. So you know the drill. You're expected to be here. I do remember this from the senior warden's remarks just now. Be here on Sunday morning for the fourth Sunday of Advent, and then God forbid you have to come back to church on the same day, later that day, because magically at noon it switches from fourth Advent to Christmas Eve. Ta-da! So you have to come to church twice. And someone will keep record of whether you do or you don't. For many of us, Advent, this time of the year, is one of our favorites. I find personally that I reminisce a lot about warm memories of years past, from my childhood, from those years as a parent of a young child myself, of time spent with family, the holiday music, the food, the decorations, the parties, and all the rest. I ad-libbed at 7:45 that I didn't realize until a few years ago that it's not the holiday season for me if I don't get pumpkin pie, because there was a year where magically, for some reason, there wasn't any. And then I've overcompensated in years past, and I almost did it again this year, but I did do it last year, where I myself ordered a pumpkin pie, not realizing that at least 2 others had already been ordered or were going to be baked, and so went overboard. I hope you don't have to learn that about yourself in the same way that I did. I hope you don't have to be deprived before you come to realize what it is that you really like. Most of my memories are good ones and fond ones, and it's nice to reminisce. But it's important to acknowledge at this time of the year that it's not a happy season for everyone. And it's important to be aware of and sensitive to that the holidays that for many, or even most of us, are very fondly remembered in happy times, that's not necessarily the case for all of us. The season of Advent, the observance of Advent, gets short shrift, I think, probably in my whole life. If you remember the Charlie Brown Christmas special, even in the mid-'60s, we were aware that rampant consumerism was taking over the holiday, and I don't think that's changed. I remember years ago being in Lowe's someplace in early September, and they already had Christmas stuff up. So for some people who hear the word Advent, they don't really know what that means, except maybe the little calendar that we used to put on the refrigerator where you would tick off the days, and there was a little perforated door to open for each day of Advent. If you were lucky to be an only child, as our daughter was, that meant you got to open all of those doors. But if you were one of three, which both my wife and I were, that meant there had to be some negotiating about who got to open which door on what day. And of course, Christmas Eve was always a special door. It was a double door, right? And so that was the real difficult day as it regards the calendar. But rather than just all of this joy and this rushing from Halloween or now even Labor Day to Christmas, Advent for us, people in the church, is meant to be a time of preparation. Preparation for the annual observance of the Incarnation, the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, the Messiah. Even in years that aren't as short as this year, Advent is a short season. There are only 4 Sundays. And in a way, we can compare this short season just before the Incarnation, before the annual remembrance of the birth of Christ, can be compared to the last weeks of pregnancy for any mother and child, family. All births are holy births. All are highly anticipated. And even now, when we know the due date almost exactly, right, except for nobody's ever born on their due date, and even the sex of the baby, there is a supercharged air of anticipation as the time for that birth gets closer and closer to the date. Again, I ad-libbed at 7:45 and said, I'm old enough that when our daughter was about to be born, we didn't have cell phones in our pockets. What I had was a pager. And I remember exactly where I was when the pager went off. I was on the elevator in the office building where I worked, and we worked on the 28th floor. And even though that wasn't a slow elevator, it felt like that elevator ride took forever until I could get up there, get off, get into the office, and make the phone call to respond to the page. In any birth, the mother and those close to her are awake and alert, even hyper vigilant as the time draws near. The season of Advent, as it progresses, is intended to be one of preparation, an expectant waiting, of mindful awareness of the coming of the Holy One, the Christ, one of preparing ourselves for the annual reminder that God loved what God created so much, loved us so much, that God chose to come among us as one of us. What king, what royal person would ever do that kind of thing? If we're observant, we notice that each year the gospel reading for the first Sunday of Advent is not about birth, is it? Jesus's or anyone else's. It seems to be about end times and the second coming of this one in the clouds, second coming of the Christ, which the early church was expecting within their lifetimes, before that generation passed away. I had a little fun with one of the new pieces of AI because I asked ChatGPT how many generations there have been since the birth of Jesus. It was way fewer than I thought it was going to be. It was only like 80 or 81. Yeah, it was my reactions. Oh, seems like it should be like hundreds, but it's not. I think it ascribed 25 years to, I got my calculator out and did the math. It ascribed 25 years to a generation, and by golly, if you do 80 or 81, that works out to about 2,000 years. So there you go. You can thank me later for that little tidbit. But what I wrote here was, it's been dozens of generations since that time. So that generation did pass away, in one sense. So if that's the case, how are we to understand a reading like this? Well, one of the things to know is that the reading for this morning is part of a much longer discourse, and much of what comes before this reading appears also in Luke and Matthew's gospel. So, for example, Jesus' prediction, as an example of that, Jesus in all of those predicted the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which they couldn't fathom. The people alive in that day, if you've ever seen it yourself, some of the, quote, building blocks, the foundation, are just massive. And even today would require somebody who really knew what they were doing to put those together, to move those about. Now I looked up too long and I've lost my place. Oh, here I am. So with respect to that, in this morning's reading, it's important to note verses 30 and 31, where Jesus says, "Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So how do we make sense of this? How do we understand this? And I think unless you are a student of this era in history, it would be almost impossible. But these words, "Truly I tell you," are an oath. This is Jesus' oath to his followers. And one component of an oath then, maybe somewhat less now, is that even if the impossible were to happen, the oath that the person is making would remain. And so for them, as good Israelites, Jesus' followers would have understood that because God created earth and made it good, that it would last forever. So God created the earth and made it good, meaning it would last forever. The earth passing away was not possible in their thinking. So what Jesus is saying is, even if the impossible were to happen, his words, his teaching, his ministry would not pass away. So in other words, even if everything you think you know about all of it were to change, the oath would remain. So we are asked to believe and to do what would still be relevant, that which Jesus taught and did and said his whole being. Jesus would still be expecting us and advocating for us to follow his teachings and his ministry. So in that cultural context, then, we can make an important shift as we think about Advent and our time of preparation. While we anticipate that Christ will come again, and we do, it is also true that Christ is already here. Both of these things can be true. Both and. But for too much of Christian history, including our own, the focus has been on this anticipated second coming at the end of the age. by shifting our gaze from Christ that is present here and now to some big event that will come later, we sometimes forget to honor the presence of Christ that is already in us and among us in each person that we encounter and in everything. So for me, the helpful thing, the relevant thing from this lesson, this reminder here at the beginning of the church liturgical year and in the weeks leading up to the incarnation, it's an opportunity to recenter ourselves, to reboot, as it were, to remember, to commemorate, to honor that Christ is everywhere, in each of us, and in everyone we encounter, and in everything, every being. The birth of a child is often a reminder that this is the case. As I said before, all births are holy. That could certainly be true for the parents, as their lives are forever changed by becoming parents for the first time. In the best sense and in the best case, they have a mind-blowing realization of their connection to all humanity and to the universe through the birth of this little one, who is their flesh and blood, their DNA somehow. I know science can explain it, but much more of human history when it couldn't. It is a miracle that in 9 months, 3/4 of a year, a human being can be developed from just 2 things. One from the father, one from the mother. And if that doesn't blow our minds every time we see it, or get a picture of that new baby that somehow we're related to, even if it's not by genetics, then we need to take our pulse. Are we even still here? And so as we anticipate again, remember I asked you how many Advents you've been through? Did anybody figure that out? It's time yet again to recenter ourselves on the importance of the presence of Christ in our daily lives every day of the year. And if we're able to be joyful in this season where in theory the rest of us together are anticipating this birth. This Advent, maybe we can do that. Maybe some of you do this every year, and so I'm preaching to the choir. I hope that'd be great. But to remember, to realize that Christ is here and now and wants us, even expects us, to follow by remembering and acting upon the timeless words of Jesus of Nazareth, whose birth it is that we're anticipating very soon. The presence of Christ has been, is now, and will always be with us. That was God's oath to us in and through the birth of Christ as one of us. So even if the unimaginable happens, that oath, that promise will still be